Today is the last in our four-part sermon series focused on the Matthew 14 passage where Jesus walks on the water in the midst of a storm, calls to them. Peter gets out of the boat, walks, sinks, gets picked back up and stuck back in the boat. And today I want you to pay attention to the fact that after all that happened, because of Peter's faith and his failure, everyone in that boat worshiped, declaring that Jesus was truly the Son of God. We're focused in the Old Testament person of David today, and I want us to look at the life of King David as an example of the ups and downs in our faith journey. Sometimes I believe that we live with an easy faith and then get troubled when the world cracks open that faith. And my prayer is that in the person of King David, we can see the value of an authentic journey with God. Success and failure, need and strength. Before I read 1 Samuel 21, I want to just call to mind the timeline of King David. It is believed that David was about 14 or 15 years old when he was anointed by Saul in the prophetic proclamation that he would become the king of Israel. And in that moment, David was not anyone to Jesse, his father, to his brothers, or to anyone else. And he shows up, and we often read this story as call, right? Part of what I want us to get at is we read these call stories, the call of Moses and the call of David and the call of Elijah, and yet we stop reading or forget that after the mountaintop of call, there's about 69,000 other peaks and valleys, which of course is where we find ourselves. David was 14 or 15 when he was anointed. And then David emerges on the scene as this young shepherd boy who is unwilling to let the army of the Philistines mock the Israelite army. And he picks up a stone, and with a slingshot, he kills the giant Goliath. And then he develops this deep friendship with Jonathan. Jonathan, who is the son and the heir to the throne of King Saul, and has all of the pleasures and joy of being a friend of the son of the king, until King Saul sees in David a threat and gets jealous. At the same time, literally, Saul is struggling mentally, there's no other way to describe it, and turns against David and chases him out of the kingdom. And David finds himself unexpectedly alone. I want you to consider in your own journey the mountaintop places where you least expected it and God poured out mercy in a way that you were willing to get out of the boat. The exhilaration of walking on the water, the moment when you looked straight in the eyes of Jesus and you thought, I know you're real. I know your work in my life is real. I feel that there is purpose and meaning in who I am. God, lead me. And then I invite you to consider the times when you were up against a mountain, a Goliath, a giant, and somehow by the mercy of God, one little stone was enough. And it all fell down, and you thought, wow, I have the power of God on my side. And then somebody got jealous. Somebody got intimidated. Somebody didn't think you belonged. And you started to be persecuted. And you were kicked out of the very place that had felt like a blessing. And what was safe all of a sudden felt very unsafe. And you found yourself running and hiding in enemy territory, whatever that was, because that felt easier than being back among your people. 1 1 Samuel 21, starting at verse 10, tells us about a David who is fleeing. Now, I want us to pay attention to the fact that I'm going to preach and read the scripture as I go here. So don't get scared. We're not going to read for 20 minutes. I promise you I won't read all the lines. But Saul is literally losing his mind, jealous of David, pursuing him to kill him. Even David's friend Jonathan cannot save him. And David is so desperate that he flees to Gath, which is where the Philistines are, which is where Goliath is from. In verse 10, it says, that day David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to David, isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Have you ever actually been scared of what people think you are capable of? You held the world together in one moment for somebody, and they believe somehow you can do it again. They see in you a strength that when it gets played back to you, you say, Lord, I can't be that strong. I don't know how I killed those 10,000s to begin with, but certainly not now. And it says in verse 12, David took these words to heart. They were not comforting. They did not build his ego. They terrified him. Raise your hand if you have ever been intimidated by what happened through you some time ago that you don't think you can repeat. Raise your hand. I can't do that every time, God. I cannot hold this family together. I cannot hold the weight of the world on my hands. I can't do it. So David literally, out of the fear, pretended to be insane in their presence. And while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. And Achish said to his servants, look at that man, he's insane. Why bring him to me? Am I so short of madmen that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this in front of him? Have you ever felt like there's so much chaos? You said, look, I got enough crazy in front of me. Why are you bringing more crazy? Take him away. Take him away. Am I so short of madmen that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this in front of me? Must he come into my house? So David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Now, I have to tell you, even for as much as I love the story of David, I really haven't spent a lot of time studying this cave of Adullam. But there's a whole theological framework around this cave. It's actually otherwise referred to as a stronghold or a fortress. My impression is that it must have been like a place, a military stronghold that people would go into to get fortified. But it also is this cave that has this deep spiritual significance because of what David does there. And it says that when David left and went to this cave of Adullam, his brothers and his father's household heard about it, and they went down there to him. And all those who were in distress, debt, or discontented, I'll say those 3 Ds again, in distress, debt, or discontented, gathered around David, and he became their commander. I want you to think about your own life. Distress, debt, or discontent. Have you ever had one of those Ds? Distress, debt, or discontent. And would to be David, the leader, that all the people who feel this way are attracted to that. They're all gathered round, all in this cave of Adullam. About 400 men were with them. It says he became their commander. And from there, David went to Mizpah in Moab and said to the king of Moab, would you let my father and mother come and stay with you until I learn what God will do with me? I don't understand what God is doing in my life right now, and my parents are not safe beside me. Will you just hold them until I understand what God is doing? So he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him as long as David was in the what? Stronghold. The cave of Adullam. Sometimes We're so unnerved by our lives that we feel safer in enemy territory until we realize that the enemies are just enamored of our power, enamored of what we've done, what maybe we can do for them. And so David fakes being insane, runs to this cave, and finds himself in this cave. I want you to consider your own journey. Raise your hand if you know you've been to Adullam. You've been there. You know what that cave is. Sometimes there's something beautiful about a cave, right? A cave is quiet, except when the 400 discontented, in debt, and distressed men show up. A cave can be quiet. It can be a fortress. It can be a space where there's finally enough room to hear your own thoughts. It can be a place where at least there's enough safety to rest. And David finds himself in this cave, and I am sure that he feels like a failure. Part of what I want us to look at today is the way in which we think exploring our calling in God is about finding all the things that we're good at and the places that we feel affirmed and the moments that God has spoken to us, and it pours out like oil, and we stand in the glory of what God has asked us to become until we fail. Peter literally had the exhilaration of walking on the water. He had the joy of eyes focused on Jesus. And he walked on water in a superhuman feat, just like David killing Goliath, or just like being anointed to become the king, until the moment that what happens? He starts to sink. And we live in a context, particularly when we talk about our faith, that we convince ourselves if we don't get it perfect, if we don't do it right, we must have failed to begin with. You must not have called me, God. Maybe I wasn't supposed to get out of the boat. Maybe I heard wrong. Ortberg asks a very important question. He says, what is your response to failure? When you know that the water underneath your feet starts to sink, when you can feel it giving way, what is it that you do? Are you someone who dives into shame? I knew I wasn't able to do this. I knew God couldn't have been talking to me. I knew that the wrong person was anointed. I knew that I never should have believed that everything they ever said about me was right. Does failure lead you to shame? What about fear? Does it lead you to fear? That creative brilliance of your mind that can imagine 1,000 more ways in which the water underneath your feet will dissipate. Are you someone who, in the face of failure, feels fear? Or what about someone who denies? It's not disappearing. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. I'm not going to talk about it. I don't want to feel it. I don't want to dialogue about it. I don't want anybody to ask me about it. I'm not going to pray. It's fine. It's fine. What about blame? When the water starts to fall, do you see everybody else's faults? It's their fault. It's this, it's that. Does the anger cloud your ability to even see God's face? Or, says Ortberg, have you learned some of the skill of determination? I think I shared this story before, but I'm going to share it again. I'm teaching so many life groups, I can't remember what I talked to with whom about what. So just give me a little bit of grace. So recently, Edgar and I were in a situation where one of our kids had something that was happening, and Edgar and I had very different responses. My response was, how did we get to this place? What is happening? What did I do wrong? What needs to be fixed? This is not the way that we do things in our family. We need to move beyond this, right? That felt like a normal response to me. What was Edgar's response? Well, if you're sinking, are you going to get back up? I thought, well, that's a funny place to start. If you're sinking, are you going to get back up? Now, Edgar has experienced far more moments in his life when the rug was pulled out from underneath. Far more times when anybody else would have said, well, that was a true washout. And his question in that moment, in the cave of Adullam, was not who caused this, how did we get here, how does this align with our values? The question was, will you or will you not get back up and move forward? That is spiritual determination. That is being taught the sense that life will knock you down. You will not always be on top. You will not always understand perfectly how you're called. You will not always face success. You will come to the limits of your ability. Somebody will harm you. You will harm somebody else. And the question when you are in the cave is, what are you going to do? Because the truth is, our journey in faith is a roller coaster. It's a roller coaster through a world that is deeply broken, groaning, it says in Romans 8, waiting for its full redemption. And so if we are defined by any time we falter, we give up far too easily. So David finds himself in this cave, and in this cave, Psalm 142, I will never hear this psalm the same again. If you have a Bible that has annotations, it's often described as David's prayer from the cave. And in the cave, David says, I cry out to the Lord with my voice. With my voice to the Lord, I make my supplication. I pour out my complaint before him. I declare before him my trouble. There's no resolution here. What are you doing? You're just whining. There is something powerful about spiritual whining to God. Right? This is not fair. This is not the way it's supposed to be. This is not where I want to be. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, God, then you knew my path. When I could not see because the blame and the fear and the shame clouded my vision, you, God, knew what the next step was. In the way in which I would walk, they have set a snare for me. When it feels like the world is against you, when injustice is prowling around, when the failure that you faced is not just a result of you, it's very easy to get tied up in how to defend yourself. David says, look on my right hand and see, for there's no one who acknowledges me. Refuge has failed me. No one cares for my soul. I cried out to you, Lord. I said, you are my refuge. You are my stronghold. You are my cave of Adullam. And in that place, God, they cannot reach me. My portion in the land of the living, attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are stronger than I. Bring my soul out of prison. Have you felt like your soul was incarcerated because you were attacked on every side? Because you were too afraid to face failure and move forward. Bring my soul out of prison. Why? So that I may praise your name. So that I may remember one more time who you are and who I am. The righteous shall surround me, for you shall deal bountifully with me. Part of what happens when we face injustice and failure and struggle, especially if we haven't developed spiritual resilience, is that we start to believe that God caused it. Why did you do this to me? Why did you let me lose sight of my calling? Why is Saul after me? King David says from the cave, the righteous shall surround me, for you, God, always will deal bountifully with me. What's your prayer from the cave of Adullam? The other figure that John Ortberg references biblically that is in a cave is Elijah. You know this story, right? Elijah is one of the most powerful prophets. Elijah goes toe to toe with the prophets of Baal. He bests them all. And King Ahab and Jezebel start to pursue him. It's the same story. He demonstrates the power and the faithfulness and the call of God, and they pursue him. And he goes into the wilderness and hides in this cave. And what does God do for Elijah? Rest, bread, and water. There's some real biblical truth to the advice, just go to bed. Just go to bed. When you wake up in the morning, it'll feel maybe a little bit different. Rest and bread and water. And then God pulls Elijah out of this cave, just like he's going to pull David out of this cave, pulls Elijah out of this cave, puts him on top of the mountain and says, wait for me to pass by, because somehow you have forgotten that I'm with you. And Elijah stands on the mountaintop, and there is a mighty wind, and there is an earthquake, and there is fire, and in all of the elements, God shows up where? In the still small voice. When Elijah and David are attentive. John Ortberg calls them lessons from the cave. What has God taught you in the cave? And how many times have you been afraid to stay there? Don't be afraid. Stay there. Whatever wants your time can wait. Stay in the cave. Speak to your God, eat, drink, listen, and wait for the presence of God to renew you. Attend to my cry, God, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are stronger than I. Bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise your name. The righteous shall surround me, you shall deal bountifully with me. The story doesn't end in the cave, folks. Just like it didn't end standing before Goliath, just like it didn't end in the moment that David was anointed to become the future king. In 1 Samuel 30, this is the same story. Remember the hills and the valleys of your life, the roller coaster ride that is faith. In 1 Samuel 30, David and his men are on the run. They are hungry. They have been in enemy territory. They're so hungry that they ate the bread off of the altar because they were that desperate. They came to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had invaded the south and attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire and had taken captive the women and those who were there. From small to great, they did not kill anyone, but carried them away and went their way. So David and his men came to the city, and there it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. Have you cried so long that you had no more tears left to cry? They took everyone, their wives and their children and all their belongings. The grief was greater than they can bear. This happened after the cave. It happened after the cave. And then they turn on David. Have the people around you ever felt so hurt they turned on you? They made it his fault. And now David is afraid for his own life. David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him because the soul of all the people was grieved. Hurt people tend to hurt people. Every man for his sons and daughters. What is the last part of that verse? Somebody say it out loud like a declaration. But David what? Strengthened himself in the Lord his God. One of the things that God, and for whatever, you're going to have to forgive me, but this passage reminds me of my husband. In the hardest moments of life, he'll say to me, have you looked in the mirror? Have you looked in the mirror? Have you spoken to God alone? There are moments when you can't come to church. There are moments where there's not a cave. There are moments when the very people who were with you are against you. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. the capacity to stay in the cave for as long as you need, and the capacity to strengthen yourself in the Lord is not about saying that community doesn't matter. It deeply matters. But we have to have the ability to strengthen ourselves in God. And then in verse 7, David said to Abiathar, the priest, Elimelech's son, please bring the ephod to me. What's an ephod? It's a prayer article that is used by men. David puts on the posture of prayer and of worship, and he goes to the Lord and he says, shall I pursue this troop? When they're out to get you, the last thing we often do is ask God what to do next. Shall I pursue this troop? Shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them? And God answered David, pursue, for you shall surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. If we skip all the way to verse 19, the end, it happens. Nothing of theirs was lacking, either small or great, sons or daughters, spoil, or anything which they had taken from them. David recovered it all. Now, if you know me enough, you know I don't like all the conquest here, and I don't like the way that it's used to justify the military power of Israel. I don't like any of it. But I believe that we serve a God that when we ask in prayer and worship, we not only can be strengthened in God, but God will restore to us. Does that mean that we get back the person whose death cuts us to the core? No. Does that mean that whatever we've lost financially or relationally is restored in exactly the same way? No, it doesn't. But it means that we walk in this way with God, that we trust that God will deal bountifully with us. There will be restoration. Your tears in the night will not be there. There will be joy in the morning. It is worth the long journey with God. And I want to end by talking a little bit about hoping and waiting. The longer I've been in this Ortberg study, the more I got frustrated by the last 2 chapters of the book. Because you know what the great conclusion is? The great conclusion of whether to get out of the boat and walk and sink and get put back in, the great conclusion is we are called to wait and hope in the Lord. I'm like, really? I had to read 10 chapters for that? That's the point. It is the up and the down of life, and yet in that journey, we are called to wait and to hope in the Lord. Ortberg says that waiting on God is different than waiting around. This is important. Waiting on God doesn't mean making a mess of your finances and waiting on God to pour out the lottery on your head. Waiting on God doesn't mean to continue to create strife in situations and waiting for God to bring peace. Waiting on God requires patience, trust, confidence, humility, and indistinguishable hope. This appears to be the sermon on Edgar and I. Early in our marriage, I was struggling. Edgar knows this. I called this woman who's a longtime friend of mine, told her everything Edgar did that annoyed me. I was like, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. She listened, asked me a whole bunch of questions. She was like, Jen, go for a drive. Go for a drive. Go for a drive. Then go back and have a conversation. She said, it's not done yet. How do you know it's not done? I feel done. Because, she said, you still have hope. And as long as you have hope, hope in what God is going to do, hope in your relationships, hope in what God is doing in your life and as long as there is a shred of hope, it's not done. So guard your hope with your life. Guard it with your life. Ortberg says that in the United States, we have this strange way of not only being impatient about everything, but there is a direct relationship between how much power we have and how little we have to wait. The more money, the more wealth, the more influence you have, the more the expectation is that you're not going to wait. And Ortberg tells this story of a CEO who goes to see his doctor, who makes him wait like everybody's doctor does. And the CEO shows up in the doctor's office and presents his doctor with an invoice. This is for all of my time that you wasted while I waited. Can you imagine doing that to God? Here you go, Lord. Here's the invoice for all the time you made. I'm not even going to preach about what that would look like. No invoices for making us wait. In the waiting, there is always movement of God. Think about the storm. Why didn't Jesus come out earlier? Why in the middle of the lake, why didn't Jesus stop the winds and the waves when Peter got out of the boat? He did what he asked. Why are you waiting, Lord? Why did he wait till he started to sink? Why did you wait till he asked for you to save him before you extended your hand? Why wait, God? Mary and Martha called for Jesus to come. Your brother Lazarus is sick and close to death. And Jesus did what? He waited. And he showed up and they said to him, if you hadn't waited, he wouldn't have died. But I believe that you just say the word and you can raise him from the dead. Jesus was crucified on a cross and he waited in the tomb. How long? Why didn't you just get up, Lord? There's something in the waiting. And I believe part of it is we're only willing to go to the cave when we're in the waiting place. And so we do not serve a God who maliciously makes us wait, but we serve a God that is active in a world that is suffering and in pain. And I close with Romans 8. Romans 8, starting at verse 18, is one of the most powerful testimonies to the power of God in the midst of a broken world. It says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed. Whatever David learned when he was fleeing for his life in the wilderness served him in some way. We don't know the full revelation. Creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. Creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice. God knows I wouldn't choose this, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation groans, not just us. And we groan inwardly. David groaned. Elijah groaned. Peter groaned. We groan as we wait for our adoption and the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we are saved. Hold on to your hope. For in this hope we are saved. But hope that is seen is never hope at all. Who hopes for what they have? But if we hope for what we do not have, we wait for it patiently. I always wonder why the people getting food sit in our parking lot for at least a half hour and wait for a box of food. Half the time I expect them to say, you could really improve this process. For the most part, that's not what happens. There is a humble, patient waiting. You could argue it's because they don't have any power, so what are they going to do but wait for somebody to give them food? Or you could argue that life has taught them in some cases that there is a spiritual strength in waiting on the Lord. So don't give up. Don't be afraid of the cave. Don't believe that the high point is the only point. And don't fall into shame and denial and blame and fear when your life is harder than you want it. Trust the God who is leading us to redemption. In Jesus' name, amen.
In the crushing, in the pressing, you are making wine. In the soil I now surrender, you are breaking new ground. a vessel. Make me an offering. Make me whatever you want me to be. I came here with nothing but all you have given me. Jesus, bring new wine.